It is Saturday, July 25th, 2026, and the single most revealing piece of footage in this entire war is still a video Iran released voluntarily. Masked commandos from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fast roping out of a helicopter onto the deck of a container ship in the Strait of Hormuz, moving down the length of the vessel, taking the bridge, standing over the ship's crew with rifles. Iranian state television broadcast it on a loop. They wanted the world to see it. They framed it as proof that Iran still controls the most important waterway on the planet. 94 days later, that same waterway is being patrolled by American aircraft around the clock. The port those ships were dragged to has been struck so many times that satellite imagery of it looks like a construction site. And the naval force that carried out that boarding operation has been reduced to a collection of small boats hiding under warehouse roofs. The footage was supposed to be a demonstration of strength. It turned out to be the highest point Iran would reach. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building since the last week of February. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched simultaneous surprise airstrikes across Iran, hitting military installations, command nodes, and government facilities. In that opening salvo, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. So was the commander of the entire Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Mohammad Pakpour, who had held the position for barely 8 months after inheriting it from a predecessor who was also killed. Dozens of senior political and military figures died inside the first hours. The Iranian state did not lose a battle that morning. It lost its nervous system. Iran's response was the only card it has ever genuinely held. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moves through a channel that narrows to a couple of dozen miles wide, and the IRGC issued warnings, forbidding passage, laid naval mines, and began firing on merchant traffic. Shipping companies did the math in an afternoon and suspended operations. Insurance markets stopped writing coverage. The most heavily transited energy corridor in the world went quiet. That is the decision that set everything that followed in motion. And it is worth understanding exactly why, because Iran did not just threaten American interests when it closed that strait. It threatened everybody's. Indian refiners, Japanese utilities, Chinese buyers, every Gulf exporter that shares the same water. Iran took a bilateral war with Washington and Jerusalem and converted it into a grievance held by the entire global economy against Tehran specifically. On March 19th, the United States began a dedicated aerial campaign to reopen the strait. Not a general bombing campaign against Iran, a targeted, methodical dismantling of the specific capability set required to close a waterway. Coastal surveillance radar, anti-ship missile batteries, mine-laying vessels, command and control links, small boat concentrations. If it could see a ship, target a ship, or reach a ship, it went onto a list. 7 days later, on March 26th, that campaign produced the single most consequential kill of the war so far. An airstrike on Bandar Abbas killed Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGC Navy, the man Israeli officials publicly identified as directly responsible for the mining operation and the closure of the strait. The same strike reportedly killed the IRGC Navy's intelligence chief, Behnam Rezai, along with other senior naval leadership. The American Secretary of War summarized it at a cabinet meeting with a line that landed harder than any press release. They no longer had a Navy, and now they no longer had a Navy commander. Hold on to that date. March 26th. It matters enormously for what comes next, and almost nobody connected it at the time. On April 13th, after the Islamabad talks collapsed without an agreement, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iran. Not a sanctions regime, not an interdiction program, a blockade enforced by the United States Navy and the United States Air Force, with the stated objective of stopping vessels from entering or leaving Iranian ports entirely. Understand what that meant in practice. Iran's entire economic existence runs through a handful of coastal facilities, oil out, refined products in, hard currency circulating between them. Close the ports, and you have not damaged the Iranian economy. You have unplugged it. American estimates put the cost to Iran at approximately $500 million per day, $500 million every 24 hours, evaporating from a state that was already running on fumes after 6 weeks of bombardment. Then came April 22nd. On that day, the IRGC boarded and seized 2 container ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The first was the MSC Francesca, a Panama-flagged vessel of nearly 175,000 deadweight tons with capacity for over 11,000 containers. According to reporting from maritime authorities, a single IRGC gunboat approached and opened fire without warning, damaging the ship's bridge. No casualties. The vessel's tracking data then showed it moving toward the Iranian coast. Roughly 3 hours later, the second incident. The Epaminondas, a Liberian-flagged, Greek-owned container ship under charter to the same operator, was fired upon about 8 nautical miles from the Iranian coastline. Its management company confirmed the vessel was approached and fired upon by a manned gunboat and that its bridge was damaged. A third vessel, the MSC Euphoria, was attacked, disabled, and ended up anchored off Khor Fakkan, unable to continue. Both seized ships were dragged toward the Iranian coast. Iran's justifications arrived within hours and contradicted each other almost immediately. The Francesca, they said, was linked to Israeli interests. The Epaminondas, they said, lacked the necessary permits and had been tampering with its navigation systems. Now, here's the detail that changes the entire complexion of the story, and it is the detail that the mainstream coverage buried under a headline about oil prices. The Epaminondas had been granted permission to transit. Iran's own authorization framework had cleared that vessel to make the crossing. The ship was operating a routine commercial run from Jebel Ali in Dubai to Mundra in Gujarat, one of India's largest cargo ports, carrying consumer goods and industrial cargo for Indian importers, with Indian nationals among its crew. It had done exactly what Iran demanded that ships do. It asked. It was told yes. And then an IRGC gunboat opened fire on it anyway. Read that again, because it matters more than anything else that happened that week. Every shipping operator, every underwriter, and every charterer navigating the Hormuz crisis had been working from a single operating assumption, that obtaining IRGC clearance before a transit provided some meaningful measure of safety. That assumption was the only thing keeping any commercial traffic moving through Iranian-designated corridors at all. On April 22nd, Iran destroyed it, not with a policy announcement, with a burst of gunfire at a ship it had already approved. The strategic self-harm in that is difficult to overstate. Iran's entire leverage over the strait depended on the world believing that Iran could grant safe passage. That is what made the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the body Tehran, stood up to manage traffic through the channel into something more than a piece of theater. It was the mechanism by which Iran intended to convert geography into revenue and diplomatic weight. The moment Iran fired on a vessel it had cleared, the mechanism became worthless. There was no longer any point in asking Tehran for permission, because permission bought nothing. And that brings us to the part that almost nobody in the coverage connected at the time. The IRGC Navy that conducted those boardings had been decapitated 27 days earlier. Tangsiri was dead. His intelligence chief was dead. The senior naval command structure had been shredded at Bandar Abbas in March. The force that seized 2 commercial vessels in the world's most sensitive waterway on April 22nd was operating without the commander who had designed and directed its Hormuz strategy, and without a formally appointed replacement, which raises the question that has hung over every escalation since: who actually authorized that operation? Because the pattern of it does not look like strategy. It looks like a force acting on standing orders and local initiative, taking the most visible action available to it, without anyone senior enough in the chain to ask whether the diplomatic cost exceeded the propaganda benefit. The answer arrived in the response. The crews were eventually released in pieces over weeks. Ukrainian and Filipino seafarers repatriated. Indian crew members confirmed safe with New Delhi's foreign ministry in direct contact with Tehran and publicly stating it was working to bring the remaining vessels back. Panama took the case of the Francesca crew to the International Maritime Organization, arguing that a master is legally entitled to switch off a vessel's identification system when facing a security threat, which is precisely what Iran had cited as justification for the seizure. The head of the IMO condemned the attacks and seizures outright. The United Arab Emirates put forward a proposal to formally censure Iran. That is the diplomatic yield of April 22nd. Iran acquired 2 container ships full of consumer goods and industrial cargo. In exchange, it handed the United States a maritime coalition, handed India a grievance, handed the Gulf states a censure motion, and handed the entire shipping industry a permanent reason to never trust an Iranian transit clearance again. And here is where it gets significantly worse for Tehran, because the American response was not diplomatic at all. The blockade tightened. By the time the first phase of it ended in late May, Central Command reported that it had redirected 94 commercial vessels and disabled 4 while enforcing the closure of Iranian ports. Iran's counter-narrative that it was winning quietly rested on reporting that at least 34 Iran-linked vessels had managed to evade the cordon, including tankers that got out laden with crude. That was true. It was also an admission. When your best argument is that some of your ships snuck out, you're not contesting a blockade. You are surviving one. The pressure produced exactly the effect that pressure of that magnitude produces, which brings us to a post that has aged into one of the most quoted documents of this entire conflict. President Trump wrote publicly that Iran was collapsing financially, that Tehran wanted the Strait of Hormuz opened immediately, that the regime was starving for cash and losing $500 million a day, that its military and police were complaining about not being paid, and he closed it with 3 letters: SOS. Read that carefully, because the significant claim in there is not the money, it is the police. A regime built on internal repression can survive almost any external pressure as long as it can pay the men who do the repressing. The IRGC is not a conventional military. It is a political enforcement apparatus with a navy attached, an economic empire, a parallel intelligence service, and a monopoly on smuggling revenue. It does not run on ideology at the operational level. It runs on payroll, salaries, housing, fuel allocations, currency access, contracts, and the guaranteed impunity that makes all of it worth taking. When the money that funds that structure goes to zero, the structure does not collapse dramatically. It starts making independent decisions. Iranian state media, for its part, called the pressure exactly what it was. Officials described the blockade as no different from bombardment. That framing came from Tehran, not from Washington, and it is the most honest thing the regime has said publicly all year. They were telling the world that the interruption of their cash flow registered as equivalent to being bombed. When your adversary volunteers which weapon hurts most, the strategic response is not complicated. That was April and May. Then the war changed shape twice more. In late June, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding. 60 days of ceasefire. The United States would end its naval blockade. Iran would guarantee safe passage for commercial shipping through the strait. On paper, it looked like the exit ramp. In practice, it was two incompatible interpretations of the same document sitting in a drawer, waiting for the first incident. The first incident came on the 6th and 7th of July. The IRGC struck two laden tankers running dark on an approved outbound route. One of them was a Marshall Islands-flagged Qatari liquefied natural gas carrier. The third confirmed IRGC attack on Qatari LNG assets this year. The other was a Saudi-owned ultra-large crude carrier. 6 vessels immediately rerouted from the southern corridor. One LNG carrier, holding roughly 900,000 barrels of cargo, simply stopped and anchored in the middle of the strait. Look closely at the target set, because this is the strategic error compounding itself. Iran did not hit American warships. It did not hit Israeli-linked tonnage. It hit Qatari gas and Saudi crude. It attacked the energy infrastructure of the two Gulf states, whose neutrality was the single greatest asset Iran had left in the region. Tehran spent 6 months insisting this was a war between Iran and the Americans, and then put Qatari and Saudi cargo inside its own targeting envelope. On July 13th, President Trump notified Congress that limited military action had resumed and declared the ceasefire finished. He described the 60-day arrangement afterward as something closer to a test, and said Iran had failed it. Central Command announced the blockade would be reimposed. Brent crude jumped nearly 10% in a single session, settling above $83 a barrel. The blockade went back into force on the 14th. And this time, Washington attached a price tag to the water itself. The president stated publicly that the United States intended to keep the strait and effectively run it, describing an American role as guardian of the waterway, and said repeatedly that the United States should be reimbursed for providing that security. Iran, through its Persian Gulf Strait Authority, claims it has already defined the boundaries of the channel and holds sovereign authority over passage. Two governments now claim the right to charge tolls on the same 20 miles of ocean. Only one of them currently has aircraft over it around the clock. Here is where things stand as of today in hard numbers. Central Command completed its 13th consecutive night of strikes against Iran at 9 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time on July 23rd. The published target set for that night led, for the first time in this July campaign, with military command centers and communication networks, followed by drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities. That ordering is not cosmetic. For the preceding 12 nights, the emphasis had been maritime assets and storage. Leading with command nodes and communications means the campaign has moved from destroying the weapons to destroying the ability to coordinate them. Since the blockade resumed 9 days earlier, Central Command reported redirecting 12 commercial vessels and disabling one to prevent traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas. More than 50,000 American service members are operating across the Middle East. Iranian authorities themselves stated that the United States had struck 95 locations across 12 cities in a 10-day window. Earlier phases of the campaign included strikes on more than 60 IRGC small boats in and near the strait, alongside air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar, and anti-ship missile capability. The IRGC's answer was to claim strikes on 85 locations of significant American military facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait. Take that number seriously for a moment. 85 claimed target locations, and the campaign against Iran continued uninterrupted the following night, and the night after that. A claim of 85 successful strikes that produces no observable change in the tempo of the operation you are trying to stop is not a military achievement. It is a press release aimed inward at an Iranian audience that needs to be told something is being done. Meanwhile, a second front opened that nobody in Tehran can control, and everybody in Tehran will be blamed for. Yemen's Houthi movement declared a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia. On July 22nd, 2 tankers were attacked, with Saudi state media confirming one of them, the Inkilia, was hit. The Houthis framed the campaign as siege for siege, retaliation for what they characterize as nearly 12 years of Saudi blockade of Yemen, a characterization Riyadh rejects entirely. Houthi sources have since indicated that Saudi Aramco facilities could become a future target if the blockade of Houthi-held ports is not lifted. Saudi Arabia has taken the matter to the United Nations Security Council, calling for condemnation and explicitly demanding accountability for the militias and their Iranian sponsors. That is the word that matters in the Saudi filing. Sponsors. Riyadh is no longer treating this as a Yemeni problem. It is treating it as an Iranian one in writing at the Security Council, and the financial track has kept tightening independently of all of it. The Treasury Department revoked the general license that had authorized production, delivery, and sale of Iranian-origin crude, petrochemicals, and petroleum products, replacing it with a wind-down authorization. Separately, Treasury moved against the shipping and sanctions evasion network of Mohammed Hossein Shamkhani, with the Treasury Secretary describing that network as one of the regime's most profitable engines. Read that in sequence with the blockade. The ships are being stopped at sea, and the financial plumbing that would have let Iran monetize whatever slipped through is being dismantled on shore at the same time. Now, let's talk about the hardware, because the specific platforms enforcing this are themselves a message, and the choice of each one tells you what the American assessment of Iranian capability actually is. The backbone is the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. These ships carry the Aegis combat system, which is less a radar than a networked fire control architecture. Aegis does not simply detect a threat and shoot at it. It fuses tracks from its own sensors and from every other participating platform into a single tactical picture. And it allows one ship to engage a target that a completely different ship is tracking. In a confined waterway crowded with small, fast-moving contacts and civilian traffic, that fusion is the entire game. The threat here was never a single missile. It was saturation, dozens of small craft moving simultaneously to overwhelm the ability of any one vessel to sort friend from foe from freighter. Aegis exists specifically to solve that arithmetic. Above the water, the platform that has done the most damage to Iranian planning is the P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft. It is built on an airliner airframe for a reason. Endurance. The Poseidon carries surface search radar, electro-optical and infrared sensors, electronic surveillance equipment, and the ability to loiter for hours at altitude, methodically building a pattern of life across an entire body of water. Refueled in flight by tankers like the KC-135, its time on station stops being a limitation at all. That capability is why the IRGC's core naval doctrine has stopped functioning. Iran's entire maritime strategy for 30 years was built on dispersal and concealment. Hundreds of small, fast attack craft distributed across dozens of coves, jetties, and warehouses along a coastline riddled with hiding places, launched in swarms from unpredictable directions. The doctrine assumed the adversary could not see everything at once. A pair of Poseidons and a persistent high-altitude surveillance platform destroy that assumption completely. The boats did not become less numerous. They became visible, cataloged, and pre-targeted. More than 60 of them have already been struck. The persistent eye above all of it is the RQ-4 Global Hawk, and its naval sibling, the MQ-4C Triton. These aircraft loiter for 30 hours and more at altitudes above most threats, carrying synthetic aperture radar that builds imagery through weather and darkness, and maritime surveillance packages designed to track thousands of surface contacts simultaneously across enormous areas. This is not reconnaissance in the traditional sense of flying somewhere, taking pictures and coming home. This is continuous, uninterrupted observation of an entire strait, feeding a network in real time. Every gunboat that moves out of a shed and into open water enters a database before it reaches the shipping lane. And then there is the strike package, which is where the F-35 family becomes relevant in a way that is specific to this fight. The Air Force variant operating from regional bases, the short takeoff variant flying from amphibious assault ships, and the carrier variant flying from the deck of the Gerald R. Ford. 3 versions, 3 basing options, 1 sensor architecture. The stealth matters less here than the fusion. An F-35 does not just carry weapons to a target. It collects, correlates, and distributes targeting data across the network as it flies, which means the aircraft executing a strike on a coastal radar site is simultaneously updating the picture for the destroyer 20 miles offshore and the patrol aircraft orbiting above. Now put yourself on the other end of that architecture. You command a squadron of fast attack boats at a naval facility near the strait. Your commanding officer was killed in March. Your intelligence chief was killed in March. Your replacement commander has never received a formal appointment decree. Your coastal radar has been struck. Your anti-ship missile batteries have been struck. Your communications networks were the lead item on last night's target list. You cannot see the ships you are supposed to be attacking, but 3 separate American platforms can see you before you leave the pier. That is not a fight. That is a countdown. Which brings us to the convergence, because the reason this has moved so fast is not any single pressure. It is that three of them are landing on the same structure at the same moment. The first is financial. $500 million a day at the peak of the blockade, ports closed, the general license for Iranian oil sales revoked, the Shamkhani evasion network under direct treasury attack, and a currency market that is priced in every one of those developments. This does not primarily hurt the Iranian people, who were already suffering. It hurts the specific institutions that need discretionary cash to function as patronage machines. The second is military. 13 consecutive nights of strikes, 95 locations across 12 cities in 10 days by Iran's own accounting. More than 60 small boats destroyed. Air defenses, coastal radar, anti-ship missiles, drone storage, and now command centers and communications. The campaign is not attempting to defeat an army. It is systematically removing the physical infrastructure required to threaten a shipping lane, item by item in public, with a press release every morning. The third is psychological, and it is the one Tehran has handled worst. Ali Khamenei was killed on February 28th and was not buried until July the 9th, more than 4 months later, after 5 days of ceremonies. Officials attributed the delay to wartime conditions and security concerns. Whatever the reason, the effect inside Iran was a 4-month national reminder that the state could not protect its own supreme leader, capped by a funeral that reportedly generated real public anger over businesses and state employees being pressed to fund ceremonies and attend events. A state that has to compel attendance at a funeral is not commanding loyalty. It is renting it at a moment when it cannot make payroll. Layer onto that the return of external opposition visibility. Reza Pahlavi has been moving through European capitals, speaking to legislators, press, and diaspora communities, explicitly framing his mission as ensuring that the voices of Iranians fighting for their liberation are heard. Whatever anyone thinks of him personally, the strategic function is unmistakable. He's reminding a world that spent months focused on missiles and shipping lanes that there is a population of 90 million people underneath this regime who did not choose any of it. Financial strangulation, military dismantlement, and legitimacy collapse, all arriving simultaneously. Any one of the three is survivable for a state like this. Iran has survived each of them separately before. What it has never faced is all three converging while the command structure is missing. And that is the section that actually explains this war, so let's go inside it properly. Start at the top. Ali Khamenei has been dead since February. His son Mojtaba Khamenei has been widely reported as his successor. Mojtaba has not been seen publicly since he reportedly suffered injuries in the opening hours of the war. Consider what that means institutionally. In the Iranian system, senior IRGC appointments are made by decree issued by the supreme leader. That is the mechanism. That is how authority is conferred and how the chain of command is validated. Now consider the case of Ali Azmaei. Iranian state media published a message in early July identifying Azmaei as commander of the IRGC Navy, the first public indication that Tangsiri's former deputy had taken over the force. There was no formal appointment decree. His predecessor had been dead since March 26th, and for more than 3 months, the most strategically significant naval command in Iran was filled by a man whose authority was announced through a funeral statement rather than conferred through the constitutional mechanism. Because the person who issues that mechanism has not appeared in public since February. That is not a technicality. That is a hole in the middle of Iranian military authority, and it explains behavior that otherwise looks irrational. Look at the rest of the structure. Pakpour, the overall IRGC commander, killed February 28th, succeeded by Ahmad Vahidi. Majid Kademi, who ran both the IRGC Intelligence Organization and the Intelligence Protection Organization, killed April 6th, with those positions reported as vacant afterward. Ali Shamkhani, former IRGC Navy commander, former National Security Council secretary, one of the political figures overseeing the nuclear negotiations, killed February 28th. Tangsiri and Rezai at Bandar Abbas on March 26th. The list of senior political and military figures killed across the war runs to dozens. What survives is a set of institutions with intact bodies and severed heads. Regional IRGC commanders who still have boats, missiles, drones, and men still have standing orders, and no longer have anyone above them with sufficient standing to overrule them or absorb the consequences of what they choose to do. This is what the April 22nd seizure was. Not a calculated escalation authorized at the top. A local force with a helicopter, a gunboat, and a camera crew taking the most dramatic action available to it in order to demonstrate relevance at a cost to Iranian strategic interests that nobody senior enough was in place to veto. The same logic explains the strikes on Qatari LNG and Saudi crude in July. Those attacks damaged Iranian diplomacy far more than they damaged American power. They happened anyway. Here is the honest strategic assessment of where this actually stands, stripped of both official narratives. The United States has effectively achieved the objective it set on March 19th. The strait is open. Central Command states it plainly, that the waterway remains transitable despite continued IRGC attacks, and that commercial vessels are navigating with American military support. That is not the same as saying it is safe. Traffic volumes remain far below pre-war levels, insurance costs are punitive, and vessels are still being fired on, struck, and turned back. But the channel is functioning, and Iran's ability to close it has been reduced from a strategic capability to a harassment campaign. Iran, conversely, has achieved almost nothing it set out to achieve, and has actively destroyed several assets it held at the start. It no longer has a credible transit authorization regime because it fired on a ship it had cleared. It no longer has Gulf neutrality because it attacked Qatari and Saudi cargo. It no longer has plausible deniability regarding the Houthis because Riyadh has put Iranian sponsorship in a Security Council filing. It no longer has a functioning senior naval command, and it no longer has the revenue that made the IRGC's internal patronage system work. What Iran does still have is the capacity to do damage. Anti-ship missiles that survived, drones, mines already in the water, hundreds of small craft dispersed along a coastline, a proxy network in Yemen that has just demonstrated it can reach Saudi shipping. None of that wins a war. All of it can kill mariners, sink hulls, and spike oil prices, which is why the next 72 hours matter more than the last 13 nights. The trajectory the evidence supports is continued attrition without resolution. Nightly strikes degrading command and communications further, a blockade tightening the financial vice, periodic IRGC attacks on shipping that produce casualties and headlines without changing the operational picture. Mediators, principally Oman, continuing to work a corridor management proposal that both sides can interpret favorably, and an Iranian state increasingly unable to make binding commitments about anything, because the authority required to bind it is missing. Which brings us to the thing that should actually keep serious analysts awake, and it is not any of the headline events. It is that the United States is now conducting a campaign designed to produce a negotiated outcome against an adversary that may no longer be capable of negotiating one. Every element of the American approach assumes a rational decision-making center in Tehran that will eventually calculate that the cost exceeds the benefit and come to the table with authority to sign. The financial pressure assumes someone is counting. The strikes on command centers assume there's a command influence. The 60-day ceasefire framework assumed a government that could enforce its own commitments on its own forces. But a regime whose supreme leader has not been seen since February, whose naval commander holds his position without a decree, whose intelligence directorates sit vacant, and whose regional commanders are acting on standing orders and personal judgment, is not a negotiating partner. It is a collection of armed actors wearing the same uniform. And that is the escalation risk that nobody controls, not a deliberate Iranian decision to widen the war. A single local commander, unpaid, unsupervised, and convinced he is about to be struck anyway, who fires an anti-ship missile at the wrong hull. An American warship, a liquefied natural gas carrier that burns, an Aramco facility, which Houthi sources have already floated as a possibility. Any one of those crosses a threshold that cannot be uncrossed, and it can happen without anyone in Tehran deciding it should. That is the structural problem sitting underneath all of it. The pressure campaign is working exactly as designed, and the more successfully it fragments the Iranian command structure, the fewer people remain who could actually accept a deal, and the more individuals remain who could start something nobody intended. So go back to the footage from April 22nd, the helicopter, the masked commandos on the rope, the bridge crew of a container ship carrying consumer goods to Indian importers, standing with their hands where they could be seen. Iranian state television put that on the air deliberately as proof of control over the Strait of Hormuz. 3 months later, the man who should have commanded that operation had already been dead for a month when it happened. His replacement still holds the job without a signed decree. The crews are home, or nearly home. The ships are a legal case at the International Maritime Organization. The port they were taken to has been struck night after night. The authorization system that seizure was meant to enforce is worthless because Iran shot at a vessel it had approved. And the waterway Iran was demonstrating control over is open, patrolled by American aircraft, with 50,000 American service members in theater and a 13th consecutive night of strikes logged 2 days ago. They released that video because they wanted the world to see who was in charge of the Strait of Hormuz. The world watched it very carefully and reached a completely different conclusion than the one Tehran intended. The strikes will continue tonight. The blockade is still in force. Somewhere along that coastline, there is a junior IRGC officer who has not been paid, whose commanding officer is dead, who has a functioning anti-ship missile and no one above him to say no, and nobody, in Washington or Tehran, currently knows what he is going to do with it. If this breakdown was useful, subscribe so the next one reaches you, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next.